Development the right way. Restructuring agricultural production and relations in Africa. Hello, I am Andrew Hensley, and this is a research study into Africa's agricultural economy, its history, and its possible future. The reality of development. Pictured on the left is Vandana Shiva, one of the world's leading reformationists in agricultural development in the entire world. Her quote on the right states, "The myth of free choice begins with free market and free trade. When five transnational corporations control the seed market, it is not a free market, it is cartel." This quote is in relation to the dominating agribusiness that exists in regions of Africa. Africa, a country with economic promise, plentiful resources, and a future that could show great development for local communities, has been barred down by non-governmental organizations as well as international actors that often go into the country to strip its resources and to exploit cheap labor, all normally for the benefit of itself. The thesis of this presentation and of this paper that I wrote is by promoting economic cooperation and expanding relations between developed and underdeveloped regions, international actors like the United States can provide sustainable agricultural growth in regions of Africa while respecting ethnical guidelines in the pursuit of international development. So what's the big idea? My main point during this presentation will be looking at the economic problems in Africa through an analysis of current practices derived from imperialistic historical roots. My main findings have shown that there is a lack of representation for shareholder farmers, as well as rising climate issues like land degradation in different regions of Africa. These findings have led me to an idea of how the US can implement a different system of aid by tackling issues like poverty and health-related crises instead of just focusing on economic development. The most important type of development isn't just an economic one, but one that increases the standard of living for the individual or community in total. This above shown by two images, one on the right being Cameroon and on the left being Arkansas, is trying to show different rice producing regions in both the state and the country. In Arkansas, the 9 major rice producing facilities contribute to over 60% of rice production in the United States, making Arkansas the #1 rice producer in the entire nation. Meanwhile, Cameroon, although 4 times larger in landmass than Arkansas, only consists of 7 different rice locations, as the country is mostly dominated by its oil industry, which harbors most of the central area of Cameroon, while the northern and southern consist of the rice producing facilities or lumber areas. However, there is still much of the land that is not being used for this rice production. Furthermore, the type of soil that makes up Cameroon is a type called ferrilitic soil, and this is very suitable for the cultivation of rice. Not only this, but the climate of Cameroon and the soil makeup it might not be as good as Arkansas's soil and climate, but it is still adequate enough for rice production. So my concept is that as the climate crisis increases, Cameroon will eventually need to turn away from oil exports, as developed countries will be theoretically buying less and less oil. By improving its other agricultural sectors, like rice production, it could work together with the biggest producer in the US, Arkansas, and obtain improved technology, knowledge, and overall build relationships with farmers in Arkansas to improve relations between both farmers in Cameroon and Arkansas that will improve their livelihood as well as production rates and values. If Cameroon takes lessons like knowledge sharing from farmers in Arkansas, not only will the production rates and amount of rice locations increase, but the value of their production can increase as well. Here's an outline for the rest of the presentation. The first point will be showing the current economic projects in Africa and the actors involved. The second will be a history of African control and the ramifications for economic imperialism, ending with a case study on Cameroon's agricultural production, specifically in the lumber industry, as well as its future. I'll then conclude with an overview of the historical impact on current economic practices in Africa's agricultural sector, as well as what the future of development and the importance of self-resiliency looks like. Current projects and actors. The first project that I would like to talk about is the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. This plan is organized by USAID and the UN to promote food security in southern Africa, and it is priced at $900,000, and it's important to note that this makes up less than 1% of USAID's annual budget. This plan is aiming to improve technology, develop plans against emergencies, improve regional data collection, and improve regional monitoring of pests. This plan arguably sounds like it's not really aiming to reduce food issues or poverty in regions of Africa. That might be because of where it's stationed. It seems that because southern African regions are arguably more developed than others, that that this plan is tending to focus on intelligence gathering rather than actual issues of food security like poverty. However, the Global Food Security Strategy West Africa Regional Plan, established in 2019, is aiming to restructure agricultural production in Western Africa for the next 5 years until 2024. This plan will be attempting to reconstruct supply chains. Supply chains are the stages that a good goes through from the process of making it to selling it. In relation to agriculture, often the producer of a product is the farmer, but then it must go through several different channels of middlemen who distribute and sell the product, and often the farmer does not receive the equal share of profits they deserve. This plan then aims to facilitate more conductive trade policy, reduce costs and time for movement of goods, and to integrate markets. Generally speaking, this plan is aiming to put smallholder farmers at the focal point of the supply chain and to further incorporate them with NGOs, national and regional governments, and other international partners. In reference to the actors involved in these current projects, I'd first like to start with agribusiness companies. The top 5 of these agribusiness companies, being Tiger Brands, Pioneer Foods, Givital, Tuget Hewlett, and Astral Foods, make up some of the most important and powerful agricultural industries throughout Africa, even more so than any regional, community, or individual farmer could even be or make in Africa. The money that is next to these brands is the billions of dollars that they make in turnover every single year. It's also important to notice that of these top 5 companies, 4 of them are involved in South Africa, while only one of them, Chivital, is involved in Algeria. This indicates that many of these companies are only involved in regions of Africa where they see economic profit for themselves outweigh the aid that they will be having to give to underdeveloped communities. So it might be safe to make the conclusion that agribusiness isn't necessarily helping those that are necessarily in poverty-stricken areas, but rather helping the most economically profitable or promised areas and the ones that are least poverty-stricken in Africa. While not as controlling and demanding as agribusiness companies, agribusiness entrepreneurs exist throughout Africa as well. Agribusiness entrepreneurs are individuals who provide local industries or producers with millions of dollars to increase production growth of an agricultural product. They act independently of businesses and often aren't as demanding as the companies can be in the process of these goods. However, there are still problems that exist with these entrepreneurs. A lot of times, these entrepreneurs will not always retain farmers' loyalty and will sometimes fail to purchase or maintain good relationships with local farmers, making it so that local farmers don't necessarily have the say that they wish they could have or that they should have. Before moving on to the international governments, the main one being China, let us return back to the United States Aid and International Development, or USAID, which is by far the largest representative for international development in America. Recent programs such as the USAID's Global Food Security Strategy West Africa Regional Plan is indicating that USAID has been taking a turn away from the white savior complex of instituting global northern policies throughout Africa and has taken a step back in trying to create dominating chains and instead letting small shareholder farmers with the resources that they need by providing them with the concept of self-resiliency so that they can use tools or resources and promote and provide for themselves. Next, let's look at China though. Is action needed now? This picture shown on the right is indicating the Chinese Road Belt Initiative established in 2013 by China. This economic plan, I should say, that extends from India through parts of Europe, also throughout regions of Eastern Africa, is aiming to promote economic plans throughout regions for economic benefit necessarily of China in some regions of Africa as well. It's interesting to note that trade values between the countries rose from 6 billion in 1995 to over 200 billion in 2014, with increases still to this year. Meanwhile, US exports in the region declined over 50% to 11.6 billion in 2014, indicating that China has taken a step up compared to America in how the US is working alongside other countries in economically developing, and it's showing that China is trying to become the world's leading economy as well. Not only this, but China is not necessarily doing it through very safe means. A lot of times China is using imperialistic pursuits or necessarily exploiting cheap labor and resources for economic profit. This is not too all dissimilar from the agricultural historical roots that have been done by both the United States and Europe through the last 100 years. This leads me to where did it all start? This middle comic is portraying the Washington Consensus that took place in 1989 with the recognition of the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and economic branches of the US. These actors have all played a part in the development of Africa, especially the World Bank recent involvement, or through at least the last 50 years, or 40 years, involvement in multiple projects alongside US aid. However, its roots in colonialism and imperialism are heightened by the issues that have occurred for the last 100 years, even more so. The book, signified by the picture on the left, The Rise of Our East African Empire, is a book that was written in the late 19th century by Frederick Lagarde. In this book, while it does consist of racist remarks against Africans and the type of imperialistic pursuits done through different regions of Europe, it is trying to show the exposition or how it exposed Africans to agriculture. There's a passage saying, by improving the status of the native, will render his land more productive, and hence by increasing his surplus products will enable him to purchase from the trade the cloth which shall add to his decency. What this passage is really trying to say is that if we show Africans how to grow crops and do this, they will be able to benefit us. They'll be able to buy our textiles, they'll be able to buy our products, and we will be economically profiting from their labor, from the knowledge that we will be giving them. This type of economic development is still somewhat in existence today, with products that often, at least in agribusiness, use cheap labor and resources that are arguably helping the long-term or the short-term benefit of these companies. So instead of trying to benefit Africans long-term, they're necessarily trying to see how fast they can grow their economy. The picture on the right, however, is an article that is written in Italian, which speaks upon the numerous colonial pursuits that the country took back in Africa, especially in Ethiopia and Eritrea. Italy has a long history of being involved with Europe throughout the last 100 years, whether it be through means of war or whether it be means through just imperialistic pursuits that have often been used for for both the economic benefit as well as just the regional power differences that they wanted to have. While this article doesn't necessarily address agricultural concepts, it does include an important section in the paper which talks about how a tombstone from a fallen Italian soldier in 1935 was thrown into the glass, and a guide explains that, and I quote, "When the Chinese built the new paved road last year, they pulled it from its previous location and unceremoniously tossed it onto the lawn." This is very symbolic for showing how one foreign power is now taking precedence over another in Africa, and the region keeps having years of new foreign entities in African countries. This, therefore, brings us to Cameroon. A case study on Cameroon, focalizing in their main sector of forestry, shows how the country has begun recent shifts in the last 20 years to improve this section of its industry that is focusing more on the community and the individual by providing native people the ability to take control over their own economy. The three main pathways that this case study will be talking about are community rights, sustainable management, and legal and institutional innovations. In reference to community rights, one piece of evidence found was that communities have begun to be prioritized in obtaining forest areas over other forest logging companies. Essentially, this is decreasing competition that local communities have to face when it comes to producing their own goods, as well as individual lumberers who are trying to start their own livelihoods. They are facing less competition from, let's say, agribusiness or other companies that are trying to infiltrate their regions or take over their areas of their land. Next, and very thankfully, we have sustainable management practices. In Cameroon, industrial logging has been banned since 2001, and mixed with the community-dominated ownership of forestry as shown by the improvement of the community rights, this has allowed artisanal practices for logging, which means less damage to forests and better management as well. Therefore, increasing communities' participation within the industry as a result from this, because the less pressure that is being used by industrial forestry practices, the more allowment for communities and individuals who would like to take a part in the forestry industry. Lastly, we have the institutional and legal innovations. Essentially, laws like community rights, but a little different, are being put in place to protect their accessibility to the forest industry recently. And most of this is being done at the regional governmental level instead of international actors trying to protect rights. It is taking regional governments to be the ones to tell other international actors to stop encroaching on the rights of these communities. And that is a very big problem that still needs to be addressed today. And there still needs to be legal and institutional innovations created to further protect community rights, as well as just legal rights within the country in general. However, international influence still exists within the country, all circling back to China's role throughout the country, or even throughout the entire regions of Africa. For example, Chinese ownership of the forestry sector is very significant, as they own around 10% of forestry permit area. So even with increasing community rights and legal institutional innovations, international actors are still very present in certain regions. And it's important to notice that because the main industry in Cameroon is their oil industry, that 10% of forestry is still a pretty significant number considering much of the land is not necessarily used for forestry. From 2019 to 2014, around 2,600,000 cubic meters of products were exported to China. This is indicating that the ownership and exportation is mostly benefiting already developed countries. And even if the home country is economically benefiting, as Cameroon is somewhat benefiting from this exportation, it's not always beneficial to the individual communities who are trying to start their own livelihoods in this industry. Studies have been showing that the increased involvement is mainly for the purpose of just log exports, and technology transfer or knowledge sharing between Chinese industries to these farmers is very limited or non-existent. Some jobs have been created, but the social insurance is poor and salaries haven't been adequate for the workers. Not only this, but illegal exploitations of environmental policies have occurred as well, which is breaking sustainable management policies that have existed for the last 20 years, and they are not being met by Chinese industries. So although the study on Cameroon's forestry policy might show improvements, the amount of international pressure and power that these countries have is overwhelming the regional governments as well as these communities. Let's do a little bit of recap then on the things that need to change. Africa is still currently dominated by agribusiness, and most of these companies are still centered in South Africa as well because of the economic promise that South Africa gives these companies. Recent shift to improving productivity and profitability of farmers. This is still while a lot of these regions are still dominated by middlemen. These middlemen are often receiving more benefits or profit than the farmers, and this is still an issue that needs to be changed and has recently by some projects, such as the Western Reformation one and by the USAID. Also, these farmers are constantly in competition with bigger businesses. For example, as we saw it with the artisanal practices of forestry workers and rival with the industrial companies in Cameroon. Dependency on global north production and finances. The issue of self-resiliency. Agribusiness does not want community farmers to acquire land rights or access to themselves or to produce their own foods and means of production. Instead, many of these NGOs enter into countries to acquire cheap labor and resources that often benefit the developed country more so than the underdeveloped one. Increased international competition. If the US does not become a bigger actor in directly reducing poverty or rebuilding relations with communities in Africa, these communities will instead turn to direct infrastructural help of China. If China is able to complete their mission of becoming the most profitable and direct actor in Africa through imperialistic means of industry and control, then US will lose its chance to help in a somewhat more ethical way by means of self-resiliency, knowledge sharing, and providing communities with more technology so that they can be producing with themselves and building relations between farmers in both regions. Roots of these problems derived from colonialism and economic systems. This has started from early colonial pursuits from both the US and Europe. These two actors both went into countries of Africa, abused cheap labor, and stripped resources in such a way that only directly benefited the development of their countries. Now these issues of increased poverty these areas are enduring increased poverty for the poorest regions of Africa, alongside land degradation and other climate problems that have been ignored in the 19th and 20th century until now. Thank you. And hopefully in the future we can see Africa's agricultural sector focused on self-resiliency and in the improvement of relations between American farmers and African farmers. Thank you again.